this is a very good venue for us. We've been an active participant for many years in supporting it, and we find the presentations to be very relevant and good, as well as the networking opportunities.
I think this is one of the great venues for having lots of professionals in the industry come together once a year, almost like a ritual, and showing the greatest and latest from everybody and talking to each other and understanding what's going on.
Conferences like this, I learn a lot. I don't travel that much. I don't go to all that many meetings, but Global Mill Satcom is one of the ones that's definitely worth going to.
We'd like to ask you, the first question is, what's the main military market for your company?
For the most part, the military market is driven by contingency operations by the U.S. government. So over the last decade, that's been in the Middle East and Southwest Asia, Iraq and Afghanistan. On an ongoing basis, the U.S. government is a global operator, though, so we provide satellite support over the United States, over Europe, over Africa, over the Middle East, Southwest Asia, and even the Central Pacific.
We talked about the U.S. Of course, it's been in the news recently that the sequestration and the shutdown has had an impact on various levels of the satellite industry. Can you tell us what was the impact for SES Government Solutions of that series of events?
Sure. The government shutdown first. The government shutdown didn't have a dramatic impact. The U.S. government sort of suspended a lot of administrative activities, so some contract awards may have been slowed down a bit and so forth, but it didn't really have a lasting impact on the business. Sequestration, on the other hand, is really an outgrowth of the failure of the U.S. Political establishment to come to an agreement about what levels of spending ought to be and what spending ought to be used for. And there's an ongoing discussion still about the remainder of this year's budget in the United States. It's likely to not be resolved on a different basis than it was last year, which means most likely sequestration will continue through fiscal year 2014, which is through the end of September of 2014. The impact of that is our government customers will be under a lot of pressure to further economize. That had an impact on our business for government fiscal year 2013, and it's expected to have an impact next year as well. Now, having said that, most of what we provide to the U.S. government is infrastructure. It's communications capacity to operate networks that they've already invested in. And so their options are limited. Unless they're able to do without those networks altogether and they're capable of shutting them down, then the impact on our business, again, will be modest. But over the long term, when your customers are under a lot of spending pressure, it's not good for your business.
What's been the reaction to these events? Have you had any specific contingencies to work with?
Typically, in U.S. government contracting, when the government awards a contract, they hold a competition, they award a contract, they will generally do it for satellite services for a 1-year period, followed by a number of option years, which they might exercise. Typically, that would be 4 option years. It's very unusual for the government to not exercise options on contracts. If they don't exercise an option, typically it's only been because the need for that network or service went away altogether. However, during 2013, the government was unable to exercise options for some services just strictly as a matter of not having the money. The priority decisions that had to be made were very, very difficult, and in some cases, government customers just had to learn how to live without satellite networks that they'd been using previously, strictly due to economic conditions.
Tell us how you see the value proposition of hosted payload, which SES has done for military customers, and how is that developing in the coming years?
I think hosted payloads are probably here to stay. The U.S. government faces the same economics in getting to space that the commercial companies like SES face, and that is it's extremely expensive on a sort of a cost per pound basis to orbit something to geosynchronous orbits. And so if there is a way for the government to get a small specialized secondary payload onto a commercial satellite, like they did on the commercially hosted infrared payload on an SES-2 a couple of years ago, I think they'll continue to look at those quite aggressively. They put in place a contract vehicle, indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity IDIQ vehicle to buy hosted payloads in the future, and I think they intend to use it. And I think it's with us to stay. It just makes good economic sense.
What do you see, therefore, as the most important technological development that could happen for the military markets in the coming years?
The military market is increasingly looking for the ability to have high data rates on smaller devices, wherever they happen to be, whenever they happen to need it. And so in that respect, they're not much different than commercial users who depend on high data rates to their iPhones or their iPads or other mobile devices. That's going to continue, I think, to spur investment in small terminals, small receive terminals that are able to be highly mobile and receive high quantities of high resolution video data and other sorts of data intensive applications. And we're going to also see an increasing need, I think, for unmanned aerial operations on various kinds of platforms. They are different kinds of specialized applications. They're not quite like the commercial applications. So if I'm a military user with an iPhone type device, my needs are quite similar to my civilian counterparts' needs. If I'm an airborne terminal on a UAV, though, my needs are not anything like the airborne terminals on a commercial aircraft, because UAVs are transmitting enormous amounts of data out of small antennas to satellites. Satellites are transmitting enormous amounts of data to slightly larger antennas on Boeing large airframes that have commercial customers. So the technical challenges are a little bit different, and they're going to require a lot of investment and development in order to work effectively.
For the capacity itself, you talked about UAVs, you talked about smaller terminals. Where do you see that demand from the military coming in the next 10 years or so? Any regions or applications in particular that you think there is definitely going to be a growing need?
Well, I think the UAV sensor packages will continue to develop. They'll continue to require extensive bandwidth to support them, so I see a continuation of current trends there. We talk about the trend of higher and higher data rates to smaller and smaller mobile devices on the ground as well. Those will continue, I think, to be important for growth of the company.
Any regions in particular you think?
Well, right now, activities in the Middle East have drawn down somewhat with the withdrawal from Iraq. I think there will be less demand coming out of Southwest Asia in the near term with the withdrawal of troops there, but an awful lot of the applications in Southwest Asia are not really dependent on the number of troops. As long as there's intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance operations ongoing in the region, bandwidth will still be required to support them. So I would say some shrinkage there, maybe not quite as substantial as the Middle East. And the growth areas are already Africa and the Pacific. Africa seems to be an area that has more activity right now, but it's just a matter of time, I think, before we see an explosion in demand in the Pacific. Part of that is driven by emerging economies there, but part of it is driven by the U.S. national security strategy, which is increasingly Asia-Pacific focused.
The title of your presentation at this conference refers to commercial satellite communications as essential infrastructure for military operations. Can you explain what you mean by infrastructure? Is SATCOM not really a service?
It's a great question, and I touched upon it in an earlier answer already, but SATCOM is, it can be a service. Quite often, mobile satellite services are referred to as a service where you buy a small handset, you buy bandwidth to go along with it at the same time, and the user doesn't have to really do anything other than turn on the on switch and transmit and then pay the invoice at the end of the month. Fixed satellite services are really not services for the most part. Quite often what they are is infrastructure. We provide enormous amounts of bandwidth to service networks which have been built by U.S. government customers, which are operated on a day-to-day basis by U.S. government customers. Sometimes we provide other networks of the components of the network other than just space segment, but quite often we're just providing space segment. So it's really not much different than fiber optic infrastructure. It's not much different than even road infrastructure in a sense. These are capabilities, commercial satellites are capabilities which are developed for commercial and government customers. They're flexible, they can service a number of different network needs and a lot of different waveforms and so forth, but they're essentially infrastructure, they're really not services.
The U.S. DoD has a global satellite system referred to as WGS, or Wideband Global System, that they use for communication. Has that impacted the need for commercial SATCOM as they have increased the size of their fleet? How do you see the trade between these systems and commercial satellites in terms of which function or applications are supported by which capability?
They provide similar kinds of capabilities. They, of course, operate in different frequencies. The typical commercial satellites that we're talking about, the ones that SES operates, are predominantly Ku band and C band frequencies. There is some Ka band, but it's mostly on the broadcast part of the spectrum, not so much in the two-way part of the spectrum. WGS, the wideband global system, is X band and military Ka band, which are completely different frequencies. So to the extent they service the same applications, you have to have duplicate ground infrastructure that can receive and transmit in either sets of frequencies. There aren't too many of those, actually. So they're not competing directly in many cases. Over the long term, the government, in some cases, would like to be able to ride on their own infrastructure. They would like to have the assured access that comes with an owned system rather than a shared system. To the extent they're investing in Ka-band terminals and X-band terminals in order to be able to do that, then they'll have a choice which way they want to go. But for right now, demand of the overall system is growing at least as fast as capacity is growing, because WGS is being deployed over many, many years. It's going to be a total of 10 spacecraft. The commercial world, just as kind of a reference point, the commercial companies with whom the U.S. government does business launch about 10 spacecraft a year. WGS will be 10 spacecraft total. By the time the last one is launched, the first will be within a few years of its end of life. So with growing overall system demand and the length of time that it's taking to roll out WGS and some of the unique aspects of a lot of the networks that will never transfer to Ka, for example, Predators and Reapers, there's not money in anybody's budget to ever operate in Ka, so they'll probably stay on Ku until they reach their end of life. So yes, there is some absorption of demand by WGS, but it's not to quite the extent or in quite the way that people might expect. And one other comment on WGS, which I think is worth making, is that WGS, as it's fully deployed with 10 spacecraft, will be deployed around the world, and it will be able to service demand wherever that demand exists. However, if you take the total capability of the whole system to react to a high-intensity contingency of some sort somewhere in the world, you can't put 10 WGSs in a box and apply all the capacity of 10 satellites. About the most you can bring to bear at any one time is about 2. And so when it comes to dealing with the most demanding environment where there's a big spike in demand in a specific location, WGS will help, but it's going to fall well short of solving the whole problem. Commercial will have to be a big part of the solution, as it always is.